Excuse me. That girl in the corner, the one in the hoodie. She doesn't belong in this lounge. I want her boarding pass checked right now." The voice was low and even, the kind of voice that had spent 3 decades learning how to give an order, while sounding like it was simply making an observation. Vivian Ashcroft set her champagne flute down on the marble side table of the Meridian One Lounge at Hartsfield-Jackson Atlanta International Airport, smoothed the lapel of her cream Armani blazer, and looked at the young attendant standing near the bar with the flat, expectant patience of a woman who was used to being obeyed before she finished her sentence. The attendant's name tag read Andre Malone. He followed her gaze across the room and found her immediately. A young black woman, maybe 22, 23, folded into one of the deep leather armchairs by the floor-to-ceiling windows that looked out over runway 8R. She wore an oversized gray hoodie gone soft at the seams, black joggers with a small ink stain near the knee, and a pair of Jordan 1s that had clearly logged more miles than most of the suitcases in this lounge. A cracked screen protector caught the light on the iPad balanced across her knees. Enormous over-ear headphones sat on her head. Beside her, a croissant had gone cold and mostly untouched on a small white plate. She looked completely at home. That, Vivian decided, was the most irritating part of all. "Ma'am," Andre said, his voice pleasant, his face doing the specific kind of neutral that service workers learn to hold like a shield. "Every guest in this lounge has been verified at check-in. Every guest holds a valid boarding credential for our premium cabins tonight." "Are you certain?" Vivian said, tilting her head just slightly. "Because I have been sitting in this lounge for almost 50 minutes, and I have not seen that young woman order a single thing beyond a coffee and a pastry. People who fly Meridian One do not usually sit in a corner working on a cracked tablet and ignoring a $900 catering menu." Andre did not look at the young woman again. He kept his eyes on Vivian. "She ordered when she arrived," he said. "She's been working since." "Working," Vivian repeated, and the word came out of her mouth like something she'd found on the bottom of her shoe. "Is there anything else I can get you, Miss Ashcroft?" Andre asked. "Another glass of Perrier Jouet, perhaps?" "Just make sure my flight to London isn't delayed," Vivian said, and waved him off with 2 fingers, the same gesture she used to dismiss interns. Andre nodded once and walked away with the particular quiet efficiency of a man who has learned exactly how to leave a conversation without appearing to have lost it. Vivian picked her glass back up, crossed one leg over the other beneath the hem of a suit that had been tailored twice, and let her eyes settle back across the room. The girl was still typing, fast. Her eyes tracked the screen with a focus Vivian recognized immediately, because it was the same focus she used to see in her own reflection 20 years ago. Not the scattered scroll of somebody killing time in an airport, but the narrow, locked-in intensity of a person working through a real problem that had real consequences. Vivian looked at the cracked screen, at the worn cuffs of the sweatpants, at the scuffed toes of sneakers that had clearly been broken in on more than one continent. None of it lined up. Not by Vivian's math. She had spent 30 years reading rooms, conference rooms, ballrooms, boardrooms, building an entire career on the belief that she could look at a person for 4 seconds and know exactly who they were and exactly how much they mattered. It was the skill that had made her exceptional at her job. Or so she told herself on nights like this one. And every single piece of evidence sitting across that lounge told her the same thing. This girl did not belong here. What Vivian Ashcroft did not know, what she could not possibly have known, sitting there with her $4,000 pitch deck resting against the leg of the table, was that in less than 11 hours, the girl in the hoodie would end her career with 4 sentences and a voice that never once rose above a whisper. She would not shout. She would not threaten. She would not make a scene. She would simply tell the truth and the truth had been sitting 11 feet away from Vivian the entire time. Across the lounge, the young woman had not looked up once. She didn't need to. She had felt Vivian's attention land on her the second it arrived, the way you feel a hand hover an inch above your shoulder before it touches you. She'd learned to recognize that particular pressure a long time ago. It had a weight to it. It always did. Her name was Maya Reeves, and she had things to do. She swiped to a new tab, opened a dense financial model, and kept reading. Revenue projections, client retention curves, integration timelines for a communications firm. Her father's company was considering as a strategic partner for their European expansion. She'd spent 3 days in Atlanta reviewing the books, sitting in on pitch rehearsals, running the numbers until midnight in a hotel room, with the television off. The trip had been useful. The target company had strong bones. It also, she suspected, had a leadership problem she hadn't fully mapped yet. A notification blinked in the corner of her screen. She tapped it without looking away from her spreadsheet. From Dad. Subject line, Ashcroft pitch, tomorrow, 9 a.m. Maya. The Ashcroft woman from Sterling & Cole lands in London tonight, pitching us at 9 tomorrow morning. Review everything you can find on their numbers and their culture before you land. I want your honest read before breakfast. Love, Dad. She read it twice, then she opened a second folder. One she'd already been building for 2 days, labeled simply Sterling & Cole. EU Expansion Review. Financial Health. Client Churn. Case Studies. Leadership Bios. She scrolled to the senior partner roster and found the name Vivian Ashcroft. 29 years with the firm. A polished headshot. A summary of major accounts. She looked at the photograph for exactly 3 seconds, then went back to her spreadsheet and took a slow sip of coffee that had gone lukewarm an hour ago. She had not flown 5 hours from New York and spent 72 hours combing through balance sheets to let a stranger's discomfort pull her focus. The work was what mattered. It had always been what mattered. Her father had taught her that. Not with speeches, but by showing her, every single day of her life, what it looked like when a person decided the work in front of them was the only thing in the room worth their attention. She tucked her feet up under her, pulled the hoodie sleeves down over her wrists, and kept going. Keep that cracked screen protector in mind. It will matter again before the night is over. The boarding call for Meridian Flight 214 to London Heathrow came 40 minutes later. Maya saved her files, zipped the folder closed, packed the iPad into the front pocket of a duffel bag that had clearly survived several international moves, and stood up. She rolled her shoulders, cracked her knuckles, and walked toward the gate with the unhurried certainty of someone who had never once needed to prove she belonged anywhere. She had no idea what was about to happen on that airplane. Then again, she never let that kind of thing distract her either. Vivian Ashcroft had not always been afraid. There had been a long stretch of her life, from her late 20s into her mid-50s, when she walked through the world with a certainty so complete it functioned like a second skin, built from ambition and discipline and the specific, dangerous confidence that comes from being right, publicly, for a very long time. She had earned it. That was the sentence she always came back to on nights like this one. She had earned every inch of it. She'd started at Sterling & Cole, straight out of Emory at 23. The most junior assistant at a firm that did not take junior assistants seriously. She made herself impossible to ignore. 16-hour days, 6 days a week, for 3 years running. She learned the machinery underneath the craft, the midnight phone calls, the client who needed his name, kept out of a headline, the senator's affair that needed to become somebody else's story first. She handled all of it with a precision that impressed people who were famously difficult to impress. By 34, she managed her own client roster. By 39, she made partner. By 45, she was the reason Sterling & Cole had a 2-year waiting list. She had built that, with her own hands, at the cost of 2 marriages and 1 relationship that had actually mattered, and a social life she had traded deliberately for a corner office on the 19th floor with a view of the Atlanta skyline. It had seemed worth it. For a long time, it had seemed completely worth it. But the industry had changed, and Vivian Ashcroft had not changed with it. She'd seen it first in the numbers 3 years ago, a slow bleed. Clients she'd held for a decade, quietly drifting to smaller, faster, digitally native shops with a fifth of her overhead and twice her reach. They didn't have her connections. They didn't have her Rolodex, but they understood where the culture was moving before it arrived, and she had underestimated that for far too long. Then the losses accelerated. A pharmaceutical client, a hedge fund, a real estate developer who'd sent her a bottle of Louis XIII every Christmas for 11 years, who called one Tuesday afternoon to say he was going in a different direction. Eleanor Sterling, the firm's founding partner and the only person in Vivian's professional life who had ever genuinely frightened her, had called Vivian into her office 6 weeks earlier. The meeting lasted 11 minutes. "The quarterly numbers are a disaster," Eleanor had said without looking up. "We are losing ground in every vertical. Our 2 largest revenue drivers are either gone or on notice." Then she'd looked up, and her eyes were very calm, which with Eleanor was always the worst sign. Reeves Capital Group is the largest independent private equity firm, currently expanding into the UK market. Julian Reeves needs a communications partner to manage his firm's public profile through that expansion. The contract is worth $11.4 million annually. Vivian had done the math instantly. "That covers the gap." "That covers the gap," Eleanor said, "and then some. Which is why I need you to understand something clearly. If you land this account, we survive. We restructure. We compete. If you don't land it, I will be forced to make significant changes to the partnership structure." Vivian understood exactly what that meant. She walked straight to her desk and started building the pitch that same afternoon. 6 weeks, every weekend, every evening. 51 pages, data encored, strategy tailored specifically to Julian Reeves's public positioning goals. It was, she genuinely believed, the best work of her career. She'd also been dealing with something else during those 6 weeks, something she hadn't said out loud, even to her own therapist. Grant Whitfield, 56 years old, silver-haired, smooth, blessed with the kind of easy confidence that comes from a life in which everything had generally worked out. Grant was pursuing a different slice of the same relationship, a separate engagement, a different division, but still Reeves Capital. He'd gotten in the door somehow, and if he closed his piece while Vivian lost hers, the conversation with Eleanor about the partnership structure would only have one possible ending. She could not let that happen. She'd told herself that every morning for 6 weeks. She told herself that in the cab on the way to the airport tonight. She told herself that sitting in the lounge, reviewing her slides for the 19th time. And then she'd looked up and seen a girl in a hoodie, sitting in a lounge chair like she owned the building, and something that had been coiling tight in Vivian's chest for 6 weeks finally found somewhere to land. It wasn't rational. Some quiet part of her already knew that. The girl in the hoodie had nothing to do with Eleanor's ultimatum, or Grant Whitfield, or $11.4 million or 30 years of a career she was terrified of losing. But rationality, Vivian had learned, was a fair-weather companion. Under enough pressure, it had a way of quietly excusing itself from the room. She had spent 50 minutes watching Maya Reeves work in that chair, and in 50 minutes she had built an entire story out of nothing. The wrong person in the right place, an intrusion into a space that was supposed to stay orderly. By the time the boarding call sounded, the story felt like fact. She was good at that, constructing narratives that felt like evidence. It was, after all, her job. Vivian stood, smoothed her blazer, gathered her carry-on and her pitch deck, and walked toward priority boarding with the measured stride of a woman who had spent 30 years making sure she never once looked rushed. She did not look at Maya again. She had already decided everything she needed to know. She was 3 steps from the jet bridge when she heard it behind her. Quick, light, easy. Safe travels, Miss Reeves. Andre Malone's voice, then a young woman's, warm, unhurried. Thank you, Andre. Same to you. Vivian slowed by exactly 1 step. Reeves. It was a common enough surname. It meant nothing. There were probably 1,000 people named Reeves boarding flights out of Atlanta tonight. She kept walking. She had a plane to catch and a career to save. Here is the first thing worth remembering about tonight. Every single person who watched what happened next had a choice about whether to stay quiet, and almost every one of them chose it anyway. The seatbelt sign chimed off 40 minutes after takeoff, and that was when the second act of the evening truly began. 3 rows back from the curtain that separated Suite 1A from the rest of Meridian's business cabin, Vivian Ashcroft had been assigned Seat 2C. A fully lie-flat business suite, $12,000 round trip, purchased by Sterling and Cole because Ellinter Sterling did not send her senior partners across the Atlantic in coach when $11 million was on the table. It was, under any ordinary circumstance, more than enough seat for 1 woman and 1 pitch deck. It was not enough tonight, because when the cabin lights dimmed for the overnight leg, and Vivian stood to stretch her legs, she looked through the gap in the privacy curtain at the front of the cabin and saw the girl from the lounge folded into Suite 1A, the single, first-class adjacent private suite. The 1 seat on the entire aircraft that came with a closing door, a personal wardrobe, and a dedicated flight attendant. Something in Vivian's chest went very cold and very still. She stepped to the curtain. A flight attendant named Grace Okonkwo intercepted her before she could pull it back. "Ma'am, is there something I can help you with?" "That seat," Vivian said, keeping her voice low, controlled, the voice she used in boardrooms. "Suite 1A. I believe there's been a seating error." Grace's expression didn't move. "I can check the manifest for you, but I promise you there's no error, ma'am." "Then check it," Vivian said, because the young woman in that seat was sitting in the lounge 2 hours ago in sweatpants, eating a free pastry. I don't say this to be unkind. I say this because I have flown this route for 11 years, and I know exactly what that seat costs. And I know exactly who typically sits in it. Grace's jaw tightened by a fraction of a millimeter. The kind of movement that would be invisible to anyone who hadn't spent a career learning to read faces for a living. Vivian had spent exactly that career. She saw it anyway, and it did not stop her. "I'll speak with the purser," Grace said, and walked away. 20 minutes later, the purser, a soft-spoken man named Owen Castellano, came to Vivian's seat personally, crouched at eye level in the aisle, and confirmed, quietly and precisely, that the manifest was correct, that the guest in Suite 1A held a fully verified reservation, and that no further action would be taken. Vivian did not let it go. This is the point in the story where the pressure that had been building for 6 weeks finally broke through, whatever was left holding it back. "I would like to speak to the captain," she said. Owen's expression stayed perfectly professional and perfectly firm. "Ma'am, I understand you're concerned, but I want to be very clear. There is no discrepancy. This request is going to end here." It did not end there. 20 minutes after that, Vivian rose from her seat, walked to the front of the cabin, and pulled the privacy curtain aside herself. "Excuse me," she said, loudly enough that 4 rows of passengers looked up from their screens. "I don't know how you got into this seat, but I would like to see your identification." For the first time all night, Maya Reeves looked up. She had headphones half off one ear, an open spreadsheet glowing in front of her, and an expression that held no fear in it at all. Only a kind of tired, evaluating stillness, the look of someone recalculating a variable she'd already accounted for. "I'm working," Maya said, quietly, evenly. "You're welcome to speak with the crew." "I did speak with the crew," Vivian said. "They're covering for you." "I don't know what this is, but I know what I saw in that lounge, and I know this is not your seat." A woman 2 rows back, 61 years old, gray hair pulled into a low knot, a paperback open face down on her tray table, set the book aside. Her name was Helen Vasquez, and she would think about the next 4 minutes for the rest of her life. She watched Vivian's hand grip the edge of the curtain. She watched Maya close her laptop slowly, deliberately, the way you close something valuable when you're making room for a conversation you didn't ask for. She watched Owen Castellano step forward, his voice dropping into the register flight crew's reserve for genuine emergencies. "Ma'am, step back from the suite, please." "I am a paying passenger on this aircraft," Vivian said, her voice climbing now, cracking slightly at the edges. "I have a right to raise a security concern. That is my right." "Your right," Owen said, "does not include harassing another guest. I need you to return to your seat immediately, or I will need to involve the captain in a very different way than you're expecting." Vivian looked at Maya one more time, and here is the moment worth freezing, because everything in the cabin changed inside it. The overhead reading lights hummed. Somewhere behind the curtain, a service cart wheel ticked against the floor track. No one spoke. Maya did not look away, and she did not raise her voice, and she did not reach for a single word of self-defense. She simply said, "You should sit down." It wasn't a threat. It wasn't even sharp. It was almost gentle, and that gentleness did something to Vivian that a shout never could have. It made the silence around her feel enormous. Vivian went back to her seat. She did not apologize. She sat down, opened her pitch deck, and stared at the cover for 11 minutes, without turning a single page, and if you had asked her in that moment what she was feeling, she would have told you it was certainty. It was not certainty. Certainty does not make your hands cold. Helen Vasquez did not stand up during any of it. She would tell you later, and mean it, that she had frozen, that 30 years of being taught not to make a scene on an airplane had welded her to her seat, and that the not standing was a decision she regretted the way you regret a missed exit on a highway, long after there's any point in turning back. But she did one thing. When the cabin lights dimmed fully for the night, and the cart passed by one final time, she leaned toward the aisle and caught a fragment of Maya's voice through the gap in the curtain, low, unhurried, speaking to someone on a call she must have taken after the confrontation ended. You can only take something from someone who gives it to you. Helen didn't know who Maya was talking about. She never would, not fully. But she opened the Notes app on her phone, right there in the dark at 35,000 feet, and typed the sentence into a folder she'd just created, one she titled with no particular plan. Things worth remembering. Keep her in mind, too. She matters again before this story ends. Somewhere over the middle of the Atlantic, at an hour with no clock that means anything, Vivian Ashcroft lay awake in a fully reclined suite that suddenly felt very small. Running the last 3 hours through her mind on a loop she could not turn off. She told herself again that she had done nothing wrong, that a security concern was a security concern, regardless of who raised it. That 30 years of instinct did not simply switch off because one crew member disagreed with her. But somewhere, underneath that story, a second, quieter voice had started asking a question she did not want to answer. What, exactly, had made her so certain in the first place? Not evidence. She'd had none. A hoodie, a cracked screen, a face. That was the entire case file, and she had built a felony accusation out of it in front of 30 strangers. She thought about Eleanor Sterling, about Grant Whitfield's easy, unbothered smile, about $11.4 million sitting on the other side of a pitch meeting in 9 hours, and the sick, sliding feeling that she may have just detonated it herself in an aisle in front of witnesses over nothing at all. She did not sleep. 4 rows forward, behind a closed suite door, Maya Reeves worked for 6 more hours. She reviewed the Sterling and Cole file one final time. The client retention numbers, the leadership bios, the culture survey results. Her father's team had quietly gathered over the past 2 weeks, results that painted a picture Vivian Ashcroft would have found very uncomfortable if she'd ever bothered to read them. 3 former employees had filed formal complaints against Vivian in the last 4 years, all involving the same pattern. Assumptions made about junior staff and clients based on how they looked rather than who they were. All 3 complaints had been settled quietly. None had ever reached Eleanor Sterling's desk because Vivian had made sure of it. Maya added one final note to her file at 4:52 in the morning, closed the folder, and looked out the window at nothing but darkness and the faint blue line of the horizon beginning to lift. She had done this before, landing and presenting on no sleep. She was good at it. The quality of her judgment on 4 hours of rest was not meaningfully different from the quality of her judgment on 8, and tonight, she suspected, she would need every ounce of it. The cabin began its descent into Heathrow at 6:12 in the morning local time. Vivian was already awake, had been for hours, holding a phone with an unread email from Eleanor Sterling sent at 11:30 the previous night. "Call me the moment you land. Before you go to the Reeves office." The tone of it, clipped, waiting, told her Eleanor already suspected something had gone wrong, even if she didn't yet know what. In Suite 1A, Maya folded her blanket. She always folded it, out of habit, for no one in particular, just because it was the kind of small order she liked to leave behind her. She slid her feet into the worn Jordans, tied the laces, and reached for her duffel bag as the wheels touched down. At the cabin door, Grace Okonkwo caught her eye. "Ms. Reeves, thank you for how you handled tonight. That should never have happened to you." Maya looked at her. "You did your job. That matters." She stepped onto the jet bridge and made it exactly 6 steps before she heard her name. "Reeves, please." She had known it was coming. She'd paced herself walking off that plane. Not fast enough to look like she was running. Not slow enough to invite it. Just the ordinary gait of someone with somewhere to be. Vivian had caught her anyway. Maya turned. Vivian stood at the mouth of the jet bridge, one hand braced against the doorframe. Her blazer was still pristine. She had not slept, had not softened in any visible way. But something underneath the posture had come loose overnight, the way a foundation cracks quietly before a building shows it on the outside. "Please," Vivian said again. Her voice had no performance left in it. "A moment, that's all I'm asking." Maya stood still and let her arrive. Vivian stopped 2 feet away, and the words she'd clearly rehearsed on some level over 6 sleepless hours did not come out in the order she'd planned them. "I owe you an apology," she said finally. "A real one. My behavior last night was inexcusable. I was frightened and under pressure, and I made you the target of something that had nothing to do with you at all. That was wrong. It was completely wrong." Her eyes stayed level, not pleading. "I'm asking you, not for my sake, for the firm's sake. The people at Sterling and Cole are good at what they do. They've built something real over almost 30 years. Please don't let what I did last night be the reason it ends for all of them." Maya looked at her for a long moment. The jet bridge hummed around them. Somewhere below, a ground crew radio crackled and went quiet. "I accept your apology," Maya said. Vivian's breath shifted, small, involuntary, the first real relief she'd allowed herself in 6 hours. "But accepting it doesn't change what I saw," Maya continued, and her voice stayed even, the voice of someone who has had a long time to think something all the way through. "You didn't make a mistake under pressure. You made a decision. And you made it before you had a single fact about me. You saw someone comfortable in a premium space, wearing clothes you didn't expect, and you decided that didn't match the picture in your head." Vivian said nothing. "Pressure doesn't create what you showed last night," Maya said. It just removes the filters people usually keep in place. And underneath the filters, what was left was a pattern, deciding who belongs and who doesn't, based on what someone is wearing, and what they look like, and how at ease they seem in a room you'd already decided should feel a certain way. A beat. I can't build my father's public reputation on a partnership with that pattern, Maya said. Not to punish you. Because it would be a liability. In rooms I can't supervise, in decisions made when no one's watching. And I would always know it was sitting underneath everything, waiting for the next moment of pressure to show itself again. Vivian's jaw tightened. I have 30 years of, I know, Maya said. I read all of it. The work is real. You built something real. Something in her voice shifted. Not softer exactly, but honest in a different register. That's what makes this sad. It didn't have to be this. You're capable of better than what I saw last night. But last night is the only data I actually have. Vivian looked at her. At this young woman in a worn hoodie and scuffed sneakers, who had sat in Suite 1A for 6 hours, and let Vivian dig this grave with her own 2 hands. She thought about the pitch deck still tucked under her arm. About 30 years. About Eleanor Sterling's voice on the phone at 11:30 the night before. Is there anything? No, Maya said gently. Then quiet, final. A silence followed that had real weight to it. Then something shifted in Maya's face. Not the flat, evaluating look she'd worn for most of the night, but something more human, something that recognized Vivian as a person now, instead of a case file. You said I didn't belong in that lounge, Maya said quietly. But I was the one sitting there, deciding whether your firm belonged in ours. She let that rest for a second. The answer is no. She turned and walked down the jet bridge. At the terminal entrance, a man in a dark suit with the Reeves Capital Group crest on his lapel was already waiting with a luggage cart. He took her duffel without a word, and they moved together through a side door marked Private Arrivals. The door closed. Vivian stood alone on the jet bridge. The pitch deck was still under her arm. Morning light came through the windows, flat and gray. Behind her, the cabin crew had already started the turnaround for the return flight. She stood there for a while that had no particular end. Then she began walking. She had a phone call to make. She had known that since 3 in the morning. Eleanor Sterling called before Vivian cleared customs. She didn't shout. That was always the most frightening thing about Eleanor. She was quietest when the news was worst. Reeves Capital's office called me 40 minutes ago, Eleanor said. Formal withdrawal from all contract discussions. Cultural costs identified directly by their VP of Acquisitions during an in-person evaluation. A pause. I also received a call from Grant, who has his portion of the relationship fully intact, and is handling the news with the restraint of a man who knows exactly how bad it would look to seem pleased. Another pause, longer this time. Don't come to the office, Vivian. HR will reach out by the end of the week. The line went dead. Vivian stood in the customs hall at Heathrow's Terminal 3 with her carry-on beside her and 51 pages of 6 weeks of work under her arm and 29 years of career unraveling somewhere behind her sternum. The hall moved around her with its usual indifferent efficiency. Rolling suitcases, boarding announcements, the endless forward motion of people with somewhere to be. She found a chair. She sat down, set the pitch deck on her knees, and looked at the cover for a long time. Then, on her way to the exit, she dropped it into a recycling bin. Here is what Vivian Ashcroft did not know yet, standing in that customs hall. Her fall was not going to end with one phone call. 3 days later, Eleanor Sterling's office opened an internal review after a second former employee came forward, unprompted, once word of the incident reached the wider firm. Then a third. Both described the same pattern Maya had already found in her father's files. Junior staff dismissed on site, clients prejudged by how they looked before anyone checked who they actually were. All 3 complaints had been quietly settled years earlier. None had ever been allowed to reach Eleanor's desk. They reached it now. Eleanor terminated Vivian's partnership within the month and ordered a firm-wide review of every client relationship Vivian had personally managed for the past 5 years. 2 additional clients, reviewing the story once it became public within their own industry circles, quietly ended their contracts as well. Vivian did not sue. She did not fight it publicly. For the first time in almost 30 years, she simply let something happen to her instead of controlling it. 4 months later, Vivian Ashcroft was working out of a small shared office space in Midtown Atlanta. No corner suite. No view. No partnership title on the door. She was a freelance communications consultant now, taking work project by project, mostly for nonprofits and small advocacy groups who needed professional guidance and were grateful for competence without the overhead of a 19th floor address. The work, she discovered, was smaller in scale than anything she'd done before. No $11 million retainers. No crisis calls at midnight from hedge fund clients. But it was real, and it solved real problems for people who genuinely needed them solved, and some nights that felt like more than the corner office ever had. She was still, as her therapist noted carefully and consistently, in the early stages of understanding how much of her judgment had been shaped by assumptions she had never once examined in almost 3 decades. That work was slow. It didn't arrive in a single revelation on a jet bridge. It arrived in small, uncomfortable recognitions, one at a time, most weeks. One morning, scrolling through a business publication with her coffee, she found a feature on Maya Reeves. The photograph showed her at a podium in London, announcing what the article called the largest acquisition in Reeves Capital Group's history. Navy suit, hair pulled back, steady and focused. Vivian looked at the photograph for a long time. She thought about the cracked screen protector, about the scuffed Jordans, about the way Maya had folded her blanket on that plane for absolutely no one, simply because it was the right thing to do. She closed the article and went back to her work. She was not who she had been a year ago. She was not yet whoever she was going to become. She was somewhere in between, moving forward without certainty in a direction she was choosing, day by day, to trust. That would have to be enough for now. There was a short interview attached to the feature. The journalist had asked Maya about her approach to evaluating business partners, what she looked for, how she made her calls. Her answer ran 4 sentences, and the publication put one of them on the cover. The way someone treats a stranger tells you everything about how they'll treat the world. Helen Vasquez read the article on her phone on a morning flight from London back to Atlanta, 3 seats behind first class, in an aisle seat she'd chosen on purpose this time. She read the quote twice, saved it into the Notes app folder she'd started months earlier. The one titled, "Still with No Particular Plan, Things Worth Remembering," and looked out the window at the clouds below. She thought about a cabin at 35,000 feet. A young woman in a gray hoodie who had worked through an entire night without ever asking anyone to notice her. A woman across the aisle who had shouted into the dark and been answered with silence, and had finally, painfully heard herself. She thought about the 4 minutes she hasn't stood up, and she thought about the fact that this time, on this flight, in this aisle seat, she would. If this story stayed with you, share it with someone who needs to hear it today. Not for the drama, for the reminder that quiet dignity is real, and it is powerful, and in the end, it wins. If you haven't subscribed yet, do it now. We tell stories like this every week. Stories about people who hold their ground when the world decides, in an instant, that they don't belong. Stories that remind you real strength never needs to announce itself. Drop a comment below. Have you ever been underestimated by someone who had no idea who they were actually talking to? We read every single one.